Somewhere near the middle of Australia, more than 400 kilometres from the nearest town of any real size, a single mass of red rock climbs out of a dead flat plain. From base to summit it stands taller than the Eiffel Tower. It runs for almost 3.5 kilometres along the ground, and by every measurement anyone has ever taken, it drops several kilometres straight down beneath the sand. Millions of people have stood in front of it. They have watched it turn from grey to ochre to blood red as the sun goes down. They have flown home and remembered it as the one still point in a flat country that never seemed to end. They have been told, every single time, the same thing, that it is a monolith, one stone, the largest rock in the world, sitting alone in an empty desert for reasons no ordinary hill has ever quite explained. But there is one detail almost nobody looks at directly. The lines running down its flanks do not lie flat, the way lines lie in a cliff face or a canyon wall. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They stand up. They run vertically, curving over the crown and diving back down into the earth, like the grain of something that was once upright and is now on its side. And that is where a very old question starts up again. What if this is not a rock at all? What if you are standing in front of a stump? What if the largest living thing that ever grew on this planet fell here, turned to stone in the dry heart of a continent, and everyone simply agreed to call the body a mountain? This is the story of Uluru. Not only the story the guidebooks tell, though we will get to that, because the guidebook story is stranger than people admit. It is also the story of who named it, who priced it, who mined the ground around it, who was removed from it, and who was finally handed it back. Because the argument over what Uluru is has never really been separate from the argument over what Uluru is worth. And once you follow the money through the red centre of Australia, the official explanation starts to feel less like a settled fact and more like a decision somebody made and kept making for a very long time. Let us start with what you are actually looking at, because the plain description is already odd. Uluru is what geologists call an Inselberg, an island mountain, a lump of rock that stands up out of flat country with nothing gradually building toward it and nothing tapering away. Most mountains sit inside ranges. They have foothills. They have a family of smaller peaks around them that show you how the land climbed up to that height and came back down. Uluru has none of that. It sits by itself on a plain so level that the rock looks less like it grew there and more like it was set down there, or fell there, and the ground healed flat around it afterward. The official account says the stone is arkose, a coarse sandstone loaded with feldspar, which is unusual because feldspar normally breaks down fast into clay. To find so much of it still locked in the rock, the standard reading is that this sand was dumped quickly and buried quickly before the weather could rot it. The story goes like this. Around 550 million years ago, a mountain range to the south, the Petermann Ranges, was being ground down by erosion. Rivers carried the debris north and spread it into a huge fan of sediment at the bottom of a basin. That sand hardened into rock. Then the whole region was squeezed by a mountain building event, folded, and tilted almost on end. The beds that were laid down flat were rotated until they stood nearly vertical. Later the softer rock around them wore away, and the hard tilted slab that was left standing is the thing we now call Uluru. Hold on to that one sentence, because it is doing an enormous amount of work. The layers inside Uluru are nearly vertical. That is not a fringe claim. That is the mainstream textbook description, printed on the signs in the national park. The beds you can trace with your eye running up the side of the rock and over the top are steeply tilted original layers of sediment. Everyone agrees the lines are vertical. The only disagreement is about why, and this is where the other reading walks in. Because if you had never been told the word arkose, and you had never been handed the 550 million year story, and you simply walked up to the base of Uluru and looked, here is what you would see. You would see long parallel grooves running from the ground up toward the crown. You would see them curve. You would see, in places, a texture that people have compared for over a century to bark. You would see great rounded ribs and deep flutes between them, and hollows worn into the surface that look uncomfortably like the sockets where branches once joined a trunk. You would see the whole mass swell out near the base the way a living tree flares into its roots. The claim, and it is a claim that has circulated in one form or another for a long time, is simple and it is audacious. Uluru is a tree, or rather, the fossil stump of one. Not a tree the size of the trees you know. A tree on a scale that would make our forests look like moss. And it is not standing, it is lying on its side. The reason the grain runs vertically up the rock on this reading is not because ancient sediment got tilted by a mountain building event. It is because you are looking at the side of a fallen trunk, and the grain of a trunk runs along its length, and this length is now pointing at the sky because the whole thing came down. Take that idea seriously for a moment, the way you would take any idea seriously before you decide whether to keep it. What would you expect to find if a colossal tree had fallen in the centre of Australia and turned to stone? You would expect the grain to run the length of the trunk. It does. You would expect the outer surface to carry something like bark, ribbed and fluted and shedding in curved sheets. Uluru sheds in exactly that way, in great curved flakes, a process the geologists call exfoliation and attribute to temperature and moisture. You would expect knots, and the scars where limbs broke off. Visitors have been pointing at features on Uluru and calling them exactly that for as long as visitors have been coming, and you would expect, not far away, more of the same. Other stumps, maybe a root ball that shattered as it hit. Look about 30 kilometres to the west and there they are, Kata Chuta, the Olgus, as the settlers named them. A cluster of enormous domed rocks, 36 of them, rounded and bulging and separated by narrow gorges. The official word for Kata Chuta is conglomerate, a rock made of pebbles and boulders cemented together, laid down by the same ancient rivers and tilted by the same ancient squeeze. But to the eye that has already decided Uluru is a stump, Kata Chuta reads as something else entirely. It reads as the smashed root mass of the same fallen giant, or as a stand of separate stumps, the broken remains of a forest that once stood where there is now only spinifex and sand. The name the Anangu use, Kata Chuta, means many heads. The settlers looked at the same shapes and saw domes. The forest reading looks at them and sees the crowns of things that were cut, or that fell, and were left to petrify in the open. And the scale is the first thing people stumble over, so let us not dodge it. For Uluru to be a stump, the tree it came from would have to have been something like 10 kilometres tall, with a trunk a couple of kilometres across. There is nothing alive today that comes within 1,000th of that. The tallest trees we have, the coast redwoods of California, top out around 100 metres. So the fringe reading is not asking you to imagine a slightly bigger tree. It is asking you to imagine a different world, one with a different atmosphere, a different gravity, a different chemistry of growth, a biosphere that ran on rules we no longer see operating. That is a gigantic thing to swallow, and it is the single strongest reason to set the whole idea aside. But notice that the mainstream is asking you to swallow something almost as strange in its own way. That a flat plain in the dead centre of a continent should hold one isolated slab of rock 500 metres high, made of a sandstone too rich in feldspar to have survived slow burial, tilted on its end by a collision, and left standing alone after everything around it conveniently wore away to nothing. Neither picture is comfortable. We have simply been trained to find one of them normal. Now, the honest thing to do here, and this niche has always tried to be honest even when it is chasing an outrageous idea, is to give the mainstream answer its full weight, because the mainstream answer is not stupid. Geologists do not look at Uluru and see a tree, and they have reasons. The vertical bedding is explained by the Petermann orogeny, an event they can date and trace across hundreds of kilometres of central Australia, not just at this one rock. The Arcos has been examined grain by grain under microscopes, and what comes back is quartz and feldspar and rock fragments, the mineral signature of eroded granite, not the cellular structure of wood. There are no growth rings in the biological sense. There is no cellulose. When you cut into a genuinely petrified tree, like the ones in the Arizona desert, you find preserved cell walls. You find bark that was bark, You find the microscopic plumbing of a living plant swapped molecule for molecule into stone. Uluru does not show that under a lens. It shows sand. That contrast with Arizona matters, so it is worth sitting inside it for a second rather than rushing past. In the petrified forest of the American Southwest, the logs are unmistakable. You can count the rings. You can see the bark. You can see the splits and the knots frozen mid-splinter, because the wood was replaced cell by cell with silica while it still held its structure. Nobody has to argue about whether those are trees. They plainly are. And that is precisely the problem the fallen tree reading runs into at Uluru, because Uluru does not preserve wood the way Arizona does. Whatever it is, it did not fossilize the way a log fossilizes. The fringe answer to that is to say the scale changes everything, that a tree that size would not petrify like a fence post, that we have no reference for what the mineralized remains of a 10-kilometer organism ought to look like. That is either a fair point about the limits of our comparison, or a convenient way to explain away the missing evidence, and honestly it can be read as both at once. This is the same argument that circles Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and the columns of the Giant's Causeway, and every other place where someone has looked at strange rock and seen the ghost of an impossible forest. The pattern repeats because the shapes repeat. Whether the shapes repeat because trees once grew that big, or because rock weathers into a small set of familiar forms, is the whole fight in one sentence. So the scientist says the resemblance to a tree is your pattern-loving brain doing what it always does, seeing faces in clouds and animals in constellations and, here, a trunk in a tilted slab of sandstone. And that is a fair challenge. It deserves to be sat with rather than waved away. The flutes are erosion running down the grooves between hard and soft layers. The bark texture is weathering along the vertical bedding. The knots and sockets are caves and hollows scooped out by wind and the rare violent rain. Every single feature that the fallen tree reading points to, the geologist has a quieter, slower, more ordinary explanation for. The question the video is really asking is not which side can name the features. Both sides can. The question is why one explanation became the only one you are ever officially allowed to hear, and what was gained by making it the only one. Because here is the part the geology argument tends to skip. Uluru was never just a curiosity in an empty desert. It was, from the moment outsiders arrived, an asset. And the history of who controlled that asset tells you a great deal about why the official story about the rock hardened into concrete. Go back to the year 1872. A surveyor named Ernest Giles, pushing through the center of the continent, sighted the domes of Catachuta from a distance and could not reach them. The following year, 1873, another surveyor named William Gosse came through and became the first colonist to reach the great rock itself. Gosse named it Ayers Rock, after Sir Henry Ayers, who was at that time the Chief Secretary of South Australia. Think about what that act of naming actually was. A man employed by a colonial government to map the interior so that the interior could be leased, mined, grazed and sold, reached the single most extraordinary feature in the middle of a continent and stamped a politician's surname on it. The rock had a name already. It had carried its name in the language of the Anangu for a length of time that makes the word ancient sound thin. But the name that went onto the maps, the name that went into the land registry, the name that would appear on every ticket and postcard for the next century, was the name of a chief secretary. Naming is never neutral. Naming is the first act of ownership. Whoever gets to name a thing gets to decide what it is, and once you have decided what a thing is, you have decided what can and cannot be done with it. The name did not come back quickly either. Ayers Rock stayed the only official name for well over a century. It was not until 1993, 8 years after the land itself was handed back, that the authorities agreed to a clumsy compromise and made the name a double one, Ayers Rock/Uluru, the colonial name still sitting in front. Only in 2002 was the order finally flipped, so that Uluru came first and the Chief Secretary's surname trailed behind it. Think about that timeline. The people had their word for the rock for tens of thousands of years. The colonizers replaced it in a single afternoon in 1873, and it then took the better part of 130 years and a land rights struggle that reached the highest courts in the country, just to get the original name printed back in front of the imported one. Names are not decoration, they are the deed. Whoever controls the name controls the story, and whoever controls the story controls the till. And what a colonial government wanted to do with the interior of Australia was make it pay. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The legal machinery for that was already grinding. The whole continent had been claimed under a doctrine that later generations would name in Latin terra nullius, the idea that the land had belonged to nobody in any sense the colonizers were willing to recognize, and could therefore be taken. Pastoral leases were carved across country that had been lived in and managed for tens of thousands of years. The people who had walked that country were pushed onto the margins of it, or onto missions, or off it entirely. The rock in the middle became, on paper, a feature inside a territory, a line item, a place a survey party had reached and recorded so that the map could be closed and the ledger opened. For a long time the rock was too remote to be worth much in cash. That changed when the roads and the aircraft arrived, because then Ayers Rock became something a colonial economy understands very well, a destination. In the 1950s the Northern Territory Administration cut tracks in, and the first tour operators began bringing visitors to camp at the base and climb to the top. A chain was bolted into the rock to help people haul themselves up the steep first pitch, and the climb became the product. For decades the image sold to the world was of tourists lined up on that chain, dragging themselves to the summit of the most sacred site of the people whose country it had always been, so they could stand on top of it and take a photograph. Nobody selling the tickets asked whether the mountain wanted climbing. The mountain was a monolith. A monolith is an object. Objects do not have wishes. The official story about what the rock is, an inert lump of stone, made the whole tourist economy frictionless. You do not need permission from a rock, and the climb was not gentle. It was steep, it was exposed, and it was scoured by wind, and over the decades dozens of people died on it, from falls and from heart attacks brought on by the heat and the effort. Each death was, to the traditional owners, a fresh wound, because under their law they carry responsibility for what happens to people on their country, and here were strangers dying on the most sacred site of all, for a photograph. For years a sign sat at the base asking visitors, in plain and patient words, "Please do not climb, this is our home and a sacred place. We ask that you respect our law and culture by not climbing." Coach after coach of tourists read that sign and climbed anyway, because the tour still sold the summit, and the official story still said the summit was just a high place with a good view, and a request with no legal force behind it is, in an economy, worth exactly nothing. Notice how neatly the geology and the cash flow line up. If Uluru is a dead slab of tilted sandstone, then it is scenery, and scenery is to be sold. You build a resort, you bolt a chain, you run the coaches, you print the postcards. Every dollar of that depends, quietly, on the rock being nothing more than a rock. Now imagine the official story had gone the other way. Imagine the science had said this is the preserved body of the largest living thing that ever existed, a being on a scale that rewrites what we think this planet grew. You cannot bolt a chain into that and charge admission to walk on its face without the whole enterprise feeling like what the traditional owners had been saying it was all along, a desecration. The safest possible story, commercially, is the boring one. The rock is a rock, pay at the gate. By the middle of the 20th century, the money had grown large enough to need protecting and organizing. The area was declared a national park, and here the two economies, the tourist economy and the older economy of the land itself, collided in the open. Because the Anangu had never stopped being there, and they had never accepted that their most important country had become a colonial postcard. Through the 1970s, as land rights movements gathered force across Australia, the claim over this country became one of the most watched in the nation. And in 1985 something happened that almost no colonial economy ever does willingly. The title was handed back. On the 26th of October, 1985, the deeds to the land were formally returned to the Anangu traditional owners. But read the fine print, because the fine print is the whole lesson. The handback came with a condition. At the very moment they received the title, the Anangu signed a lease agreeing to lease the land straight back to the National Parks Agency so that it would continue to be run as a park for tourists. The lease ran for 99 years. So the ownership changed hands on paper, and the traditional owners gained a real and hard-won say and a share of the gate. But the machine kept running, the coaches kept coming, the chain stayed bolted to the rock. Ownership and control are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where money lives. You can hand someone the title to the most sacred rock on the continent and still keep the turnstiles turning, as long as the lease is written the right way. For the traditional owners, the rock was never a monolith and never a stump either. In the Chukurpa, the body of law and origin that Anangu culture rests on, the surface of Uluru is a record. Every cave, every fissure, every stain and scar and ribbed flank is the physical trace of ancestral beings and events, a text you can read if you are taught to read it. The marks the geologist calls weathering and the fallen tree theorist calls bark are, in that older account, the fossilized evidence of things that happened in the creation of the world. It is worth noticing that both of the outsider readings, the sandstone one and the tree one, are doing something the Anangu account was already doing. They are insisting that the surface of the rock is not random, that it means something, that it is the frozen record of an event on a scale far larger than a human life. The colonizers' science and the fringe theory are, in their different ways, both fumbling toward a thing the oldest continuous culture on Earth had said plainly all along. This is not just a rock. Keep pulling the thread of the money, because it runs past the rock and out under the whole basin. The sand and stone of Central Australia sit on top of the Amadeus Basin, a vast bowl of ancient sediment, and that basin holds oil and gas. Not far from Uluru, fields with names like Marini and Palm Valley were drilled and brought into production, piping gas toward Alice Springs and beyond. So the same deep structure that the textbook uses to explain the rock, the ancient basin, the folding, the burial, is also the structure that petroleum geologists mapped in order to find hydrocarbons. The science that names the rock and the science that prices the ground beneath it are the same science, funded for the same reasons, carried out by people whose surveys had to close and whose maps had to balance. When an explanation pays for itself, it tends to win. Not because it is a lie, but because the money keeps the lights on in the one building where the answer gets decided. And that is the quiet economic thesis under this whole strange story. In the red centre of Australia there was a landscape that could be read more than one way. The people who had read it for tens of thousands of years read it as living law. The colonizers who arrived read it as an asset, and the reading you adopt determines what you are allowed to do. If it is law, you tread carefully and you ask. If it is an asset, you name it after a politician, you bolt a chain into it, you sell the climb, you drill the basin, and you write the handback lease so the coaches never stop. The official geological story, the dead slab of tilted sandstone, is not a conspiracy, but it is convenient. It is the version of the rock that lets the ledger stay open. And any rival reading, whether it is the ancient lore of the Anangu or the wild idea that the thing is a fallen tree, threatens the ledger in the same way by insisting that the rock is not an object you are free to use. So what happened to the climb, in the end? For decades, the traditional owners asked people not to climb, and for decades people climbed anyway, because a monolith cannot say no, and the signs at the base were only a request. But the balance of ownership and control had been slowly shifting since the handback, and in 2017 the board that runs the park, now with a majority of Anangu members, voted to close the climb for good. On the 26th of October, 2019, exactly 34 years to the day after the title was handed back, the chain was shut. The last climbers came down, the route was closed. For the first time since the tour buses started arriving, the answer from the rock, spoken through the people who own it, was no. And the thing that had been sold as scenery for over half a century was allowed, at last, to be treated as something that could refuse. Notice what did not happen. The resort did not close. The town built to service the tourists, Uluru, kept its hotels and its airstrip and its swimming pools. In fact, the resort had quietly changed hands a few years earlier in a way that fits the whole pattern almost too neatly. In 2011, the entire Ayers Rock Resort was bought by an indigenous body, the Indigenous Land Corporation, for a sum in the hundreds of millions of dollars, so that the profits from selling the view of the rock would at least begin to flow back toward indigenous hands. It was framed as a correction, and in a real sense it was one. But look at what the correction accepted. It accepted that the rock is a product, that the view has a price, that the right response to a century of others profiting from the sacred is to make sure the sacred profits its own people instead. That is justice of a kind, and it is not nothing. It is also proof of how total the victory of the asset reading had become, when even the handing back of the money is organized around the idea that the mountain is scenery for sale. The gate kept taking money. What changed was who decided, and what you were permitted to do with the rock once you arrived. The asset did not stop being an asset, it just gained the power, through its owners, to set a limit. And even that limit arrived wrapped in economics, because a rock you cannot climb but can still photograph at sunset is, it turns out, perfectly sellable. The postcards did not stop. They just changed the picture on the front. Now come back to the vertical grain, because after all the history it hits differently. Stand at the base again. Run your eye up the long parallel grooves that lift from the ground and curve over the top and dive back down the far side. The geologist says tilted beds. The Anangu say the marks of creation. And the fringe reading says the length of a fallen trunk, grain running along the wood, the whole enormous body of a tree lying on its side where it came to rest, its outer surface fluted and ribbed like bark, its neighbours at Kata Tuta the shattered stumps and root balls of the same lost forest. The mainstream can answer every one of those features, one at a time, with erosion and orogeny and the honest absence of cellulose under the microscope. It is a strong answer. It is probably the answer. But it is worth asking why it had to be the only answer, and who benefited from closing the file so early and so hard. Because the pattern in this niche is always the same, and Uluru fits it exactly. There is a landscape. It can be read as living or read as inert. The living reading belongs to the people who were there first, and it comes with obligations, with a no, with a limit on what can be extracted. The inert reading arrives with the surveyors, and it comes with a name from the capital, a lease, a gate, a chain, a drilling rig. And the science that hardens the inert reading into settled fact is, 9 times out of 10, the same science that was paid to close the map so the country could be sold. The tree may be nonsense. The vertical grain may be nothing but old sediment stood on end by a collision 500 million years ago. But the reason you have only ever been offered one story about the largest rock in the world is not that the other stories were tested and failed. It is that only one story ever let the coaches keep coming. They handed back the title in 1985 and kept the lease running to 2084. They shut the climb in 2019 and kept the resort. They named it for a chief secretary and printed that name for 100 years. And through all of it the grooves ran vertically up the flank of the rock, the way the grain runs up the side of something that used to stand, and almost nobody was ever encouraged to ask the obvious question out loud. Whether the thing in the middle of Australia is a mountain, or a marker of law, or the fallen body of the largest living thing this planet ever grew, the one certainty is that it was never allowed to be free. Somebody always owned the answer. Somebody always priced the ground, and the story you were handed at the gate was, every single time, the story that kept the gate open. Make of tea.